I really appreciate being here, and it's a nice break from talking about abortion all the time. But because it's something I don't talk about much publicly, I have to stick to my notes somewhat. So forgive me. Also, I think the presentation helps, even though it's a very small document. It's one of the shortest documents of Vatican II. You know, in the middle of my law school education in Berkeley, the Holy Spirit inexplicably called me into the Catholic Church. I was raised, much like Dr. Wazenga, what I would call generic Protestant. Like many California Protestants and many Protestants today, we didn't identify with any particular denomination. It's unusual, actually, in the United States where you find people who are Lutheran that call themselves Lutheran. Most of them just call themselves Christian. They just know a few things. One is they're not Catholic. So I had a little bit of Southern Baptist upbringing. I went to a Missouri Synod Lutheran school, dabbled in some more of the modernist churches, had some evangelical influence, and was attending a Presbyterian church before I became Catholic. Like all Protestants I knew I was Christian, and I knew I definitely was not Catholic. I had only attended a handful of Catholic masses in my entire life. My journey to the Catholic Church was mostly through reading Scripture, some theology, and history. And it wasn't because I was familiar with the liturgy. I wasn't familiar with the liturgy at all, or forms of Catholic worship. I eventually read a number of conversion stories, and I learned from those stories that when the time came that you felt you needed to talk to a priest, you better find the right priest. Because a lot of priests don't understand where converts are coming from, and they may just send you away. As it turned out, one of those conversion stories I had read was written by a guy who lived in Berkeley. So I called him up, found him in the phone book or something, told him my predicament very clumsily, and he seemed to understand what I was talking about and gave me the name of two priests. After one name, he said Dominican. I wrote it down, Dominican. And after one name, he said Melkite. I wrote it down with the phone number. Now, I didn't know a lot about the Catholic Church, but I had some idea what a Dominican was. I knew that Thomas Aquinas was a Dominican. It was a religious order. Didn't know what Melkite was, so I figured it must be one of those Catholic religious orders out there. And I don't know who I called first, but the one I first reached was this priest with the Melkite after his name. I talked to him, called him. He agreed to meet me on campus, and thus began my instruction with this priest. Now, he said he was a Catholic priest of the Byzantine Rite, and I didn't know what that meant, what Byzantine Rite meant, or Melkite. Neither meant much to me. He invited me to the Divine Liturgy. He didn't call it a Mass, but he warned me it may seem very strange and foreign. I attended and experienced my first Byzantine liturgy. Everyone stood through the entire liturgy. Everything was chanted. There were bells and incense and a lot of crossing oneself and some Greek thrown around. But afterwards, people asked me if I thought it was really strange compared to the Catholic masses I had attended. And I thought about it and I said, not really. All Catholic masses and stuff, you guys are just saying strange. You know, from my non-liturgical background, the Roman Catholic masses I had attended were just as strange with all your kneeling and standing and kneeling and standing. And the lack of singing. I had never seen that in any church that I had ever gone to where you had a choir that sang and the congregation didn't. As you know, that's pretty common in our Catholic churches. So I learned, by the way, that the Melkite Catholic Church was a Catholic church with its roots in the Middle East, and its adherents are mostly of Arabic descent. But no one in that community was of Arabic descent. In fact, I later found out that none of them had been raised Melkite. Half of that community were converts like me, from Judaism, Protestantism, and atheism, a few former communists in the crowd. And the other half were Roman Rite Catholics, or came from another Eastern tradition, Orthodox or Catholic, but no Melkites, no Arabics around. And that began my journey, not just into the Catholic Church, but the world of the Eastern churches. But I eventually had to tell my very non-Catholic mother, and that's putting it lightly to say non-Catholic. So I called her and told her that I decided to become Catholic, and she said, "What kind of Catholic?" I said, "What do you mean?" I wonder if she meant like liberal Catholic, or she said, "Well, Roman Catholic or Greek Catholic, Byzantine." And the question floored me, because my mother was never Catholic. We never even talked much about the Catholic Church, and if it wasn't positive. And I'd already learned that most Roman Catholics didn't know anything, even the existence of Byzantine Rite Catholics. So I answered her. I was just stunned, I really was, and just said, Greek Catholic. And she said, "Your grandmother was Greek Catholic before she got married." And so I found myself coming back to the world, apparently, that my ancestors were from, that they had lost touch with. So what was this world of the Eastern Catholic churches? Do we have any Eastern Catholics here? Okay, that's about par for the course. And how much anyone familiar with the Eastern Catholic churches at all? So we got more than usual, probably. So who are these churches? What are they? And the story begins, of course, with Christ. And we talked about this already. Christ established the church on the foundation of the apostles, possessing the fullness, there's that word again, fullness of the truth. The Catechism says the fullness of the means of salvation, which he has willed in 1, complete confession of faith, 2, the full sacraments of life, or sacramental life, and 3, an ordained ministry and apostolic succession. Now, just as the apostles were in union with St. Peter, the first pope, the successor of the apostles were in union with the successor of Peter from the very beginning. So the church really begins in Palestine, specifically Jerusalem, but it quickly spread. It spread north to Antioch, which was the first place where the Christians were called Christians. From Antioch, it spread to Rome. We know that Peter and Paul went that way to Rome. St. Mark went down to Alexandria, which was a major capital of the Greek-speaking world at the time. And eventually across Anatolia to Constantinople, which was later on the other capital, other than Rome, of the empire. And we know that even during the apostles' times, it spread from those major sees. Now, I should back up. Those 5 sees are what they call the historic sees of Christianity, and they have a special place in the history. Jerusalem, Antioch, Alexandria, Rome, and Constantinople. But from those sees, they spread out even further. Tradition has it St. Thaddeus and Bartholomew went to Armenia, which was the first nation to become officially Christian before Rome. It went from Antioch east, across to Mesopotamia, down. St. Thomas spread the gospel all the way to southern India. My map actually didn't even go all the way to southern India. During his lifetime, there's good historical evidence for it. From Alexandria, it went all the way down to Ethiopia. From Alexandria and across from Rome to northern Africa, where St. Augustine was from. From Constantinople, of course, the Greek world, and eventually the Slavic world, through the Rus. Each one of those places, they established these churches. Now, I start off by talking about the church, and then we're talking about churches. And you got to ask what gives. Christ established the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. But as the New Testament tells us, like when Paul wrote to the Corinthians, we were talking about this morning, he talks about writing to the Pope in Corinth. To the church in Corinth. And so the New Testament actually calls these churches, but they are part of the universal church. A group of believers that constitutes its own particular church exists in communion of faith and sacraments with their bishop ordained in apostolic succession is what we call a particular church. And in each of these places, Christians developed their own traditions, outlooks, and practices. The sacraments were the same. Remember, there's fullness in the sacramental life. And they're same in substance, but they may have differed in their usage, appearance, and practice. The Eucharist, for example, is always sacramentally the body and blood of Christ. But in one particular church or tradition, it might use leavened bread, and in another place, unleavened bread. Or it might be given to infants in one place, but only older children or adults in another place. Moreover, the ways of worship developed according to those own cultures as it spread. Now, it may seem strange to us that have existed in the Western world for so long, where the overwhelmingly majority of Catholics are Roman Catholics, and the liturgy seems the same at almost every church, sometimes down to the very detail. But for the first half of Christianity, variety, not uniformity, was the norm. And we'll explain why it changed. But it has to do mostly with historical developments that separated the Roman Church from all the other churches, and a tendency in the Western mind to favor legalism and uniformity. So, what were these traditions that developed? Let's go through them. First, some clarifications as we talk about them. You hear the word rite and you hear the word church. For the most part, when I'm talking in this talk, I'm going to use the word tradition to what is sometimes referred to as a rite. It's the particular way of worshiping, particular way of the liturgy, of a practice. We are most familiar with the Roman rite or the Latin rite. Rite is not synonymous with church, but sometimes they're used interchangeably. There can be many churches that use the same rite. For example, the Byzantine rite there are many churches that use the Byzantine rite. Does that make sense? Okay. Moving from Antioch was the Syriac tradition, which is divided actually into two traditions. The Western Syriac tradition comes from Antioch, has its roots in St. Peter, and that developed into the Maronite Church, which is mostly in Lebanon, the Syriac Church, which is in the Middle East, and down eventually the Syro-Malankara Church in India. The Eastern Syriac tradition would be, again, spreading from Mesopotamia, Antioch down. St. Thomas spread it to the Middle East, mostly Iraq. That's the Chaldean Church. And then all the way down to the Syro-Malabar Church in India. So we end up with two different rites down in southern India. The Armenian tradition developed the Armenian rite. Tradition says it's St. Thaddeus and St. Bartholomew that evangelized Armenians, and that church basically was in the area of Cappadocia, which is in Turkey, and now Armenia. And again, Armenia was the first nation to become Christian. The Alexandrian tradition flows out of Alexandria in Egypt. It's what we call the Coptic Church, and down in Ethiopia, which is still a majority Christian nation, with the Ethiopian Coptic or Ethiopian Gaiz Church. And then there's the Byzantine tradition, which initially spread from Antioch again to the Greek-speaking world. Antioch was like the center. You had Aramaic, you had Syriac speakers, you had Greek speakers. The Greek-speaking world spread the Byzantine tradition, which developed out of the traditions of Antioch originally, and then spread throughout the world, but mostly the Greek-speaking world at the time, and then eventually the full Slavic world, all of Eastern Europe. And then there's the Latin tradition, which developed out of Rome, again with its roots in St. Peter and Paul in Rome, and that spread across through Western Europe. There are a few other rites in the Latin tradition that you don't see that often. Ambrosium, some of the Serum. There is one called Mozarabic, and some people consider the Anglican tradition as a rite in itself within the Western rite. We'll see how that goes, but it's essentially a similar idea that since it came out of the Roman tradition. Now, the original 5 principal sees I mentioned were each presided over by a patriarch, who is a bishop presiding over all the other bishops of that particular tradition or area. Other areas of tradition later were given their own patriarchs, And in other cases, a metropolitan bishop fulfills that role. And this practice developed from the New Testament times. The ultimate responsibility for the traditions, practices, disciplines, and administration rested with the patriarch or the metropolitan bishop. Because he presides in charity over the universal church, the Bishop of Rome was not responsible for those matters except within his own right or territory. So questions of dogma, doctrine, they go to the Pope or an ecumenical council at times, but matters regarding traditions, practices, discipline, the administration, that belongs to the leader of the particular church, which would be the patriarch or the major archbishop. So I kind of explained this. In the liturgy and administration questions, they go up to the patriarch. The Pope, in the Eastern Church, the Pope is not responsible for that, with some rare exceptions which I'll mention. But questions of faith and morals, they answer to the Pope eventually. In the Roman Church, which we're all familiar with, the Pope is also the Bishop of Rome and a number of other titles. It used to be called Patriarch of the West, but Benedict XVI dropped that title because he felt it wasn't accurate, but it's similar. Everything goes back to the Pope in the Western Church because he's also in charge of the Western Rite and the Roman Rite and those under the Roman Rite. Now, unfortunately, what happened was, with time, many of these communities became separated from Rome and the West entirely. What triggered these separations can vary from place to place and time to time and church to church. And I can't go into all of them, but the first break was probably the first Council of Ephesus, which dealt with how we expressed the two natures of Christ. That led to some breaks among some of the Syriac churches. Then we had another breach after the Council of Chalcedon in 451, another council concerning expression of the two natures of Christ. And that led to a break from other churches within the Syriac tradition, the Alexandrian tradition, and the Armenian tradition. So they were already breaking away. You had the initial Muslim conquest. Alexandria fell in 641. That provided more of a physical, not a doctrinal issue, but just made communications, relationships among the various sees more difficult and sort of contributed to the isolation of the churches. In 1054, you had the great East-West schism between many of the Byzantine churches and Rome. And if that wasn't enough, the fall of Constantinople to the Ottoman Empire in 1453 effectively cut off Rome from much of the Eastern world. I want to suggest that in addition to this, though, I actually have another map that can show this. Let's see if it comes up. I want to suggest that in addition to this, the cultural and political isolation exacerbated differences between the West and the Eastern churches that would play a factor all the way up to Vatican II. Through much of its history, the Eastern churches, just look at the map, existed in isolation, sometimes always from Rome, but sometimes even from each other. I mean, down here, the Indians became so isolated from the West that when the Portuguese missionaries came, the Jesuits, in the 1500s, they were shocked to find Christians there. They didn't even know that they were there. So when you're in the minority with dealing with oppressive governments and you're just barely surviving, your tendency is just to focus on preservation and not make waves with the rulers who could just kick you out at any time. And also you focus on your own little community. We'll talk about, this is fascinating too, and if I run over, I'm sorry. But from here, there were missionaries that established churches all the way to China, and some people think Japan. And there's archaeological evidence for that. They completely disappeared because mostly of travel barriers, and the churches died out. So we often think of this as completely non-Christian, but the initial missionary activity was more east than west in the early church. The West, on the other hand, experienced a number of developments that the East didn't experience, and it changes our perspective on things. The West experienced the growth of the printing press, the Protestant Reformation, the Counter-Reformation, all the missionary activity, the discovery of the New World and all of that missionary activity. And at the same time, the Counter-Reformation and the Protestant Reformation led to a tendency in the Roman mind to be suspicious about variety in liturgy and to insist on more uniformity in the way liturgy was practiced. Now, those separated from Rome became known as Orthodox, those that separated doctrinally for doctrine reasons or dogma. But for every church, every single one of them, or tradition that was out there, there were some who never left Rome or union with Rome or reunited in union with Rome, recognizing the Bishop of Rome as the Supreme Pontiff. Now, how union was established, or reestablished with Rome, really, reestablished, varies from church to church. Some never left. The Maronites in Lebanon never left, and they had protection from various groups and survived. They said they never left union with Rome. Some said they never left, but were isolated for some time. The Melkites were isolated. They claimed they never left union with Rome. They just showed up in the 1700s in Rome and said, "We've been gone for a few centuries. Can we get back in your councils and stuff?" And Rome was suspicious because they didn't know who they were. It's a lot of interesting stories here. Some were reunited by rulers. The Ukrainians and Ruthenians are good examples. Some formally split from the Orthodox churches and reunited with Rome in a very formal way. There's examples of the Copts and some of the Syrians doing that. So those are all interesting stories. But eventually we have 22 Eastern Catholic churches that reunited with Rome in some way. And there they are, the official names. The ones in light blue use the Byzantine Rite, which comes out of Constantinople, and then the Eastern Europe, or Greek-speaking world. The one in orange is the Armenian Rite. There's only one church that uses the Armenian Rite. The ones in that purple color are one of the Syriac. I always get it mixed up. That would be Syriac West, I think. No, that's Alexandrian. Purple is Alexandrian Rite. Green is the Syriac West, and the other purple is the Syriac East Rite. And all of those are the Eastern Catholic churches. Just to make it clear, those are all the Catholic churches. 22 plus one church, which is the Roman Church, which is over 98% of all Catholics belong to that one in the yellow bar. So we're talking a lot of different churches, but almost everybody is Roman Catholic, except for the few that just like 1.8% or something that belong to the other Catholic churches. Now, reunion did not come without difficulties, though. There's a tendency for Rome to be decentralized decision-making into Rome. There has been, at times, a sense of Roman superiority, the Western preference for uniformity that I mentioned, just a lack of familiarity with different cultures when the reunion occurred, dependence upon Western missionaries. When lands began to open up, especially after the Counter-Reformation, and we had a great missionary activity again, Jesuits and Franciscans in particular went east into particularly Orthodox territories, and sometimes others, to try to bring people back into Rome. And that caused some problems, which I'll get to in a second. Also just loss of leadership, because here we had very small churches and sometimes oppressive territories or countries, and there was a lack of formation, a lack of leadership just to keep the churches going at times, and so it was difficult sometimes just to get to Rome. The popes would set up some Byzantine seminaries in Rome to try to deal with this issue. But that led to more of Roman ways seeping into the liturgies, which I'll also talk about. Sometimes patriarchs were asked to submit to Rome. And then there's this big problem in more recent centuries about the diaspora, what they call those that have emigrated out of the traditional lands. People from the Middle East coming to the United States, Slavs coming to the United States. Now we have an issue with Indian Christians going to Arab lands, and that's what they call the diaspora. The problem is, when those Eastern Catholics came to the United States, there wasn't any hierarchy, any parishes, any priests, and how do you deal with them, and who do they answer to? There's a historical trend here, which I think is very important for understanding this. We're talking about 2,000 years again. And the historical trend, it's not always the rule, but historical trend is that the Pope has stepped in to protect the Eastern churches, that the problems have mostly come from the curia that administers Rome, all those cardinals, bishops, whatever, the missionaries, and sometimes the local bishops. I'm going to give two examples of how these work out. One, an example of the Pope protecting the Eastern Church. Now, reunion with Rome often resulted with this missionary activity by Roman Catholic priests that would come in, especially Jesuits and Franciscans. But they brought with them their own Latin rite practices, and they often insisted that some of these practices be incorporated into the rites and traditions of the Eastern churches. In the first part of the 18th century, Franciscan missionaries who worked in the Middle East did this with some of the Melkite communities there. And it led to divisions within the Melkite church. There were those who had followed the pure Byzantine rite, and then there were other parishes basically that had mixed the Latin rite with the Byzantine rite, causing some division. Pope Benedict XIV, however, did not approve of this, and in 1743 issued an important document that demanded that the Melkites not change anything in the Byzantine rite, that the mixed rite be restored to a pure Byzantine rite, and it told the Franciscans and other Roman priests to stop trying to do that and don't try to get Byzantine Catholics to change to Roman Catholics. And he forbade them from doing this. Now, this event is very important and significant because at the time, the Melkite Patriarch, the one actually in charge of liturgy, was letting this happen, either expressly or just allowed it. And so one church historian describes it as, this is what the role of the Supreme Pontiff, the Pope of Rome, is for the Eastern Catholic churches. That is, the papacy looks at the good of the universal Catholic Church as requiring the continued existence of the different rites and the different churches, and that as Pope, as protector of the universal church, he has the right to intervene in matters of a particular church when it was required for the good of the universal church. But papal intervention at times didn't always happen and was rare, and often abuses or mistreatment happened due to local ordinaries. The treatment of Eastern Catholics in the United States is a really good example. Celibacy was the issue. Celibacy is not a doctrinal issue. It's a matter of discipline. And Eastern Catholic churches, some of them, have always ordained married men from the earliest of times. Now, historically, the Pope always defended the right of those churches to ordain married men. When, however, Eastern Catholics began to emigrate to countries like the United States, where celibate priests were dominant, married priests, and by all implications the Eastern Catholics that followed them, were looked down upon and faced outright hostility. And the most infamous example concerned John Ireland, who was the first Archbishop of Minneapolis-St. Paul. In 1889, a Ruthenian Catholic priest named Alexis Toth came to Minneapolis to minister to a small community of Ruthenian Catholics that had immigrated to northern Minneapolis from Slovakia. The practice at the time was that because there wasn't a Ruthenian Catholic diocese basically here, that he was supposed to go and submit his credentials to the local Latin ordinary, the Roman Catholic bishop. So he did, and he had his credentials that were signed by his bishop back in Hungary. Toth asked if he had been married. Ireland asked Toth if he had ever been married. Toth was a widower, so he had been married, but he wasn't married at the time. And the story goes that Ireland tossed the credentials back at him and said he wasn't allowed to be a priest here. Father Toth explained that he was ordained by his bishop in Hungary, and it was a Catholic church, and Ireland said, "I do not consider that either you or this bishop of yours are Catholic." He forbade Toth from ministering in the archdiocese and instructed all of his clergy not to have any association with Toth. He also required that all of his priests state publicly from the pulpit that not even Ruthenian Catholics could receive sacraments from Father Toth. But Archbishop Ireland did not stop there. He then began a campaign across the country and all the way to Rome to get every Byzantine Catholic priest in the United States expelled. And historical accounts say that Ireland had a lot of support from his fellow bishops. Now, this prejudice and hostility toward the Eastern Catholics had a very unfortunate consequence. Father Toth knew that he, not Ireland, was right, and he continued to minister to the area's Ruthenian Catholics without the support of the local Catholic Church. But by 1891, he and his parishioners had had enough, and they left the Catholic Church and joined the Orthodox Church. That trickle developed into a flow, and across the country, with an estimated, and it's a conservative estimate, 250,000 Eastern Catholics left the Catholic Church for the Orthodox Church during those right around the turn of the century. So that's an example of unfortunate things that have happened. So these were some of the questions that existed all the way up to the eve of Vatican II. Let's see. I got the wrong slide there. Or maybe I just got the wrong page here. That's okay, that's why I have that, I guess. So some of the questions that were on the eve of Vatican II was the Latin rite superior to the other rites? It never had been, but around 18 something, I can't remember now. I think in the later half of the 19th century, there was a document from Rome that said the Latin rite was superior to the other rites. That caused some problems. If we are one church and we want to look unified, does it require more homogeneity among the rites? Is more Latinization? What was the relationship between the patriarchs and the supreme pontiff, and the patriarchs to each other, and the patriarchs to the cardinals? What was the relationship between the Eastern churches and the curia that run things in Rome? There was still this question of ordination of married men. There was a question about the permanent diaconate. The Eastern Catholic churches had long had a permanent diaconate, but had died away through the ages. They wanted to restore it. Could they restore it on themselves? Did they have to ask the Pope? Could they go ahead and do it? The question of appointment of bishops. There were some that strongly argued on the eve of Vatican II that even the appointment of bishops had to be made by the Pope of Rome, the Pope. And the patriarchs, some of the patriarchs said, no, that's our business. There was still this problem of proselytization of Eastern Catholics by Latin Catholics, jurisdiction over the Eastern Catholics outside of their traditional territory. If you were an Eastern Catholic and you came to the United States or Argentina and there was no priest, who do you answer to? Or if you're Father Toth, who do you answer to? Questions about relationship with the Orthodox. Could they worship together? And then there was a big question about Latinizations. What I mean by Latinizations is, when those missionaries came, or sometimes Eastern Catholic churches would manage to get somebody sent to Rome for formation, they'd come back with Latin practices, things from the Roman Rite. A few examples of these, and these would find their way into the Eastern churches. One big one is the Filioque and the Creed. That's the part where it says the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son. Traditionally, Eastern churches have never said and the Son. We understand it similarly, but express it the same way. Express it differently. but that had found its way into some of the Eastern practices. Kneeling during divine liturgy was considered abhorrent to many of the Middle East Catholics because kneeling meant something else than it does in the West. But it found its way in. Confirmation only by priests, which was somewhat impossible. Was it possible? Because the tradition of confirmation only by bishops was impossible in some of those far out-reaching areas. Confirmation of infants. Traditionally, it was done in some of the Eastern Catholic churches. It's not done in the West, and they had changed that. Same with communion. Which calendar do they follow? The Latin calendar. Statues began to show up in Eastern Catholic churches, which they don't belong there because they don't have statues. They have icons. Stations of the Cross. Liturgy began to be spoken rather than always chanted, and there were other architectural things that seemed to reflect the way things were done in Rome. Which brings us then again to Orientalium Ecclesiarum, the decree on the Eastern churches. It's one of the last decrees or documents from Vatican II. It was approved overwhelmingly. It consists of 8 parts. It's short. I didn't bring copies, but you can read it. It's a quick read. And now, to understand the decree on Eastern churches, it helps to read Lumen Gentium about the church, the universal church, and the document on ecumenism that we talked about this morning. Initially, there was a proposal to talk about the Eastern churches within Lumen Gentium, and another proposal to talk about it within the discussion on ecumenism, because, as was mentioned this morning, on the mind of the fathers very much at Vatican II was unity. And they looked at the first place we ought to have unity is with the Orthodox, and the bridge to the Orthodox is the Eastern churches, so they almost put it into the part on ecumenism. But because it was part of the Catholic Church, and because there were certain questions that had to be answered, it eventually got its own document that was specific to itself. Basically, the document contains 2 sets of discussions. One is just a statement of truths about the universal church and the particular churches, and especially the Eastern Catholic churches. And the rest are guidelines for practice and reform. Those are things that are very specific, which is probably why it's probably those reasons it ended up in a separate document. So these are the main points, and I'll go through each one of them, but those 3 are the ones that deal with the truths, and the others deal more about, okay, here's some suggestions or things we're going to do about reform following the council. Now the preamble contains a lot of the main points right there. And I'll read the whole preamble. The Catholic Church holds in high esteem the institutions, liturgical rites, and ecclesiastical traditions, and the established standards of the Christian life of the Eastern churches, for in them, distinguished as they are by their venerable antiquity, there remains conspicuous the tradition that has been handed down from the apostles through the fathers, and that forms part of the divinely revealed, undivided heritage of the universal church. So now we have it here. You have the Eastern churches are part of the universal church. This sacred ecumenical council, therefore, in its care for the Eastern churches, which bear living witness to this tradition, in order that they may flourish, and with new apostolic vigor execute the task entrusted to them, has determined to lay down a number of principles. That goes to the second part of what I was saying is in the document. In addition to those that refer to the universal church, meaning the principles and stuff that are in the other documents are also binding upon the Eastern Catholic churches. Everything else is remitted to the care of the Eastern synods, which run the Eastern Catholic churches, and of the Holy See. So they didn't take the Pope out completely. But they're saying this is really the business of the Eastern churches, and at times the Holy See. The main discussion about church and churches. The Universal Holy Catholic Church consists of particular churches, of which the Latin or Roman Church is only one among many. All the churches are of equal dignity. The fact that one is larger than the others does not change this truth. The fact that the Supreme Pontiff happens to also be the leader of one of the churches, the Roman Church, does not change this truth. and they have self-rule. The churches of the East, as much of those of the West, have a full right and are duty-bound to rule themselves in accordance with its own established disciplines. Then they move on to the sort of principles and guidelines for reform and renewal. The churches should take steps to return to their ancestral traditions, i.e. get rid of the Latinizations. But they did not give specifics. Why? Why?
Each church.
Right, because that's the business of each particular church, not the council or the Pope to say, get rid of that. How am I doing on time? Okay, I'll talk about the patriarchs. I almost was going to cut this part out. There is a section on the role of the patriarchs, by which they say, by the name Eastern Patriarch is meant the bishop to whom belongs the jurisdiction over all the bishops, not excepting metropolitans, clergy and people of his own territory or right, in accordance with canon law and without prejudice to the primacy of the Roman pontiff. Hidden in there is a little hint of where they were trying to answer the question about jurisdiction. It's not just territory anymore. It's jurisdiction over your church, even in the diaspora. Now, this gets interesting here. Well, make sure I get this right. So it's not limited to territory, and the document says they have a right to establish new eparchies, which is an Eastern name for diocese, and appoint bishops. And that major archbishops have the same right of patriarchs. With regards to bishops, though, it does say that they can nominate bishops of their own right within the territorial bounds of the patriarchate, or outside the territorial bounds, without prejudice to the inalienable right of the Roman pontiff to intervene in individual cases. So there's this tension here a little bit that the Orthodox they have some problems with this when they look at this, because they say, look, you say the patriarchs are free to run their own churches, but there's this little clause in the document that says that the Pope can get involved in individual cases. And remember, they're writing this with an eye to reunion with the Orthodox, always in the back of their mind. So some of the Orthodox have said, well, they shouldn't have said that then. This may not seem too important to us, but it was very important to the patriarchs. Through time, questions had arisen about the authority of patriarchy, and this goes to the first session of Vatican II, even the pre-sessions actually. Patriarchs are invited, they come in. Where are they seated? Because in Rome, everything has symbolism. And were they to be seated after some of the cardinals? Because in the Roman mind, you have the Pope and you have the cardinals. But the patriarchs are the highest in the church of a particular church. No one's higher than the Pope. And so they had to work this out. In fact, the council, there were so many protests and fights at the beginning, they had to work this out on just where they sat. And eventually at the early sessions of the council, they sat all the patriarchs here and all the cardinals on the other side. So they would face each other. So the document makes it clear that they're equal in dignity, as it was for the first 1,000 years of Christianity. They're all equal in dignity, but the highest in honor is Rome, followed by Constantinople, Alexandria, Antioch, Jerusalem, and then the others all same, because those are the 5 major sees, and that restores the traditional places of honor that existed prior to 1054 with the East-West break. And again, think about what's behind the document. They're thinking about unity with the Orthodox. And until Rome had said that they were restoring the traditional places of honor, there wouldn't ever be union with the Orthodox. Or will not be. So, what's next? Then they went on to make some clarifications about the sacraments. There were some Latin restrictions that have been placed on the Eastern administration of sacraments that just developed over time. They said to remove them. I'll go through some of them quickly. They said priests can administer confirmation as long as they use chrism blessed by a patriarch or bishop. It doesn't have to be a bishop. Priests are permitted to baptize the faithful of any rite or church. That makes sense, especially after what we learned this morning. go ahead and restore the permanent diaconate. There was some question about the validity of marriages. The canon law had developed according to some Western traditions that didn't work according to Eastern traditions, and they worked out. It's kind of complicated, but they worked it out, and it's mentioned in there. Moving from sacraments to just worship. This is interesting. Only the Pope and the Ecumenical Synod, the document says, can alter common feast days. I presume that means like Christmas. But calendar and feast days specific to a particular church belong to that church, so you can have your own calendar. But the common feast day did not apply to Easter. It says that the Eastern churches can make their own decision onto which Easter to have, the one the Orthodox use or the one that Latin Rite use. So far as I know, all the Eastern churches, Catholic churches, use the Eastern, the same as the Latin Rite, the Roman Rite, so we all have Easter together. But you have to think about it. In some countries, it really bothers Christians that half of one village celebrates Easter on one day and the other half, Orthodox, celebrates on another day. And so that's why they left it to the individual churches, I guess. Liturgical language questions belong to a particular church. It was, of course, the Roman Rite that came out of Vatican II and had the big change in language. Most of the Eastern Catholic churches were already using the vernacular. But they mention it here because it's now going to be established that, yeah, that's a matter for the churches. There's a whole discussion again about the relationships of the Orthodox, though most of it is addressed in Lumen Gentium. They make it clear that the Orthodox sacraments are valid. An Orthodox Christian can receive the sacraments in an Eastern Catholic church, and an Eastern Catholic, if there's nothing else around, can receive the sacraments in an Orthodox church. There's some warnings about common worship. They said we can, sacraments are the same. You can do some things together, but still there's a division in the body of Christ, and you got to be careful about common worship. After the council, some of the churches immediately restored traditions and removed the Latinizations. The Melkites did it immediately. Others were slow and resistant. Any idea why? Change, yeah. It had been gone on so long that for some, it was the way they worshipped. And they resented the kneelers being taken out or having to stand the whole time and so on, or having the creed changed on them. Some churches immediately set up jurisdictions outside their traditional regions. I noticed that in the late 60s, about 1971, when a number of the Eastern eparchies in the United States were established, some sought to immediately shed the image of being an ethnic church, and others resisted that change. Others have tried to shed it, but haven't been able to. Melkites are a good example. There's a very important document from 1970 by the Melkite Eparch for the United States that says, we are not an Arabic church. We're not going to be a Middle Eastern church for immigrants in America. We're going to be an Eastern Greek Catholic church for all Americans. The problem with that vision, though, is that in more recent decades there have been so many Syrians and Lebanese Palestinians that have Christian Catholics that have come that the church finds itself administering to immigrants, and it's hard to get to shed the call to have Arabic in the liturgy and so on. Again, in many ways, all of Vatican II is sort of a blueprint for the future, and it takes a while for some things to happen. The Code of Canons for the Eastern churches came in 1991. That was very important. The document calls for a new canon law for Eastern churches. It's finally finished in 1991. And then a very important document from John Paul II, Orientalium Light of the East, in 1995. And it's one of several documents that John Paul II did on the Eastern churches, where he says the church breathes with two lungs, east and west, and that all Catholics have an obligation to learn about the other traditions and the churches. Significantly, also, Orientalium comes after the fall of communism, because with communism, many Catholic churches Eastern Catholic churches in Eastern Europe were closed, suppressed, priests and bishops who were arrested. The property was given over to Orthodox churches, and many parishioners followed. So when the fall of communism came, Eastern Catholics in Eastern Europe wanted to sort of stretch their freedom again, reestablish, get their properties back, and it caused tensions with the Orthodox. And that's the story of our relationship with the Orthodox. Just when we think we're getting closer, something political or something happens to make things difficult again. And John Paul II wanted to try to immediately address some of those concerns by shining a light on the Eastern churches. And then this is very important, the instruction for applying the liturgical prescriptions of the Code of Canons of the Eastern churches, which basically was Rome saying, look, if you haven't gotten rid of the Latinizations yet, get going with it. It's basically what that instruction is all about. There's still today issues about married priests. Rome, some in Rome, let me give a good example. Where is that? Just last year, Cardinal Leonardo Sandri, who was prefect of Vatican's Congregation of the Eastern Churches, told the Eastern Catholic bishops that they should start embracing celibacy because mandatory celibacy is the general rule for priests in the U.S. Ghosts of John Ireland started rising on the blogs and stuff, and they'd say, what happened to Vatican II? So there's still this view among many in the Curia that we shouldn't have married priests in the United States. The view among Eastern Catholics is, if you're a bishop and you're going to ordain married priests, don't ask Rome, because they can't do anything about it. But if you ask Rome, they're going to say no. And some of the eparchies that have come to the United States or established have asked. The Melkites, for example, won't ask, but they haven't done it yet either. There are married priests here, but they're all immigrants. Another big problem is the College of Cardinals. What is the relationship? College of Cardinals, is it to elect the Pope? Is it to advise the Pope? Or is it something within the Roman Church only? And so those questions still need to be resolved, especially in the minds of the Orthodox. There's still reluctance to restore some traditions. And then another big issue, that again, politics and socioeconomic things, is at this rate, there will be very few Christians, Catholic or Orthodox, in the Middle East. They are leaving in such droves. The number that have left Iraq in the last few years is astonishing. I mean, it's just a fraction. About 90% of the churches have closed. Right now in Egypt, the Coptic Catholics and the Coptic Orthodox are under a lot of stress. And in Syria, it's going to be a very difficult situation when things settle down there. Syria happens to be the patriarchal home of the Melkites, the Syriacs. Lebanon is for the Maronites, and Lebanon was a predominantly Catholic nation until about 10, 15 years ago, and now it's not. Just immigration is changing things rapidly for the Eastern Catholic churches. So moving again, the main message. Importance of an equal dignity of all the Catholic churches and the principles of the Eastern Universal Church that are in the decree tell us something about the entire church. And they set, again, a roadmap for the future. We're united in faith, sacrament, and charity, but there can be legitimate diversity in expression. And if we are going to have unity with other Christian communities, starting with the Orthodox, we need to understand and embrace what the decree actually says. The church is slow, it takes some time, but the Holy Spirit guided the Ecumenical Council in telling us that we can get back to the way we were at the times of the Apostles.
Recorded in the Diocese of Bismarck, North Dakota.